So, I wanted to return to some topics about Heart of a Dog. We talked about how it functions on one level as an allegory for the project of the new Soviet man. And so we thought through the position of the Bolsheviks as they inherit, in a sense, the people that make up Russia after the revolution and after the Civil War, right? And there's a serious question about how we are going to be able to reform not just the government, not just the economy of Russia, but the people of Russia, thinking through materialist understandings of human personality and how inherent ideology is to every aspect of Bolshevik thinking and eventually to Soviet society in general. And so one of the things that this book does, I think probably the easiest thing to understand what this book does, is to make an allegory out of the unsuccessful attempt to turn a dog into a man, right? And so in the broadest possible strokes, we attempt this project of making literally a new Soviet man, and it turns out terribly. And okay, point made, Bulgakov. But if this book were just that, it would not be as interesting or enduringly popular as it is. And so I think we can take a deeper dive that one of the things this book is fundamentally about is humanness itself. And I'm hoping that we can also carry that line of thinking into next week when we think about Butler's work, Bloodchild. But first, let's do some more specifics. How does the book get at this? Well, one of the things that the book talks about, which I don't want to go too deep into this because this is a real narrow part of history, but one of the things that the book picks up is thinking in the 1920s in Russia about genetics, actually, like the literal science of genetics. It was just the very beginning of scientific thought about genetics generally in the world, but there were serious scientific inquiries about what exactly in human nature is heritable and how malleable that inheritance is. Now, as we know, in the West, pursuing this led to truly ugly eugenics movements. So, I mean, using the term eugenics is right away this like, right, this kind of red flag. I will say, though, that when these early Russian scientists were thinking about genetics and eugenics, it was not necessarily in the sinisterly racist ways that that we come to associate the term within the West, although its eliminationist thinking insofar as it's seeking to select for human traits, right? For what's considered desirable human traits and weeding out undesirable human traits. And whenever we start to think about who's a desirable and who's an undesirable human, we're probably destined to go down a bad road. And one of the things we could say for the Soviet Union is that they arrested themselves and didn't, although not for the right reasons. But Bulgakov is really engaging here in 1925 with what is at the time really popular science. To the point where like sort of any, like literally what we would think of, what used to be in magazine form as popular science, what now people get online, but like, really that average people were sort of interested in these ideas about this new science of genetics and what it meant about human beings and what it meant about human heritability, and could that heritability determine certain elements of human personality? If that was the case, was that malleable in some way? Like, could you breed for it? And also there's a detour down neo-Lamarckianism. So if we think back to thinking about Darwin, one of the competitors, so to speak, of Darwinism is the idea from Lamarck that one can develop in life traits in response to the environment that you are in and stressors and challenges that the organism faces in life, and then those traits that one develops in their lifetime become heritable to the next generation, which of course is an idea rejected by classic Darwinism, although it's now in modern thinking not wholly without truth when you think about, you know, the environment in the womb and the malleability of the brain when young and dealing with sort of stress situations and so forth, that people really do in some sense manage to inherit certain elements of stress, though not quite as Lamarck said. And this is getting into the weeds a little bit, and again, I don't want to get us too far down these kinds of paths, but just to say that one of the things that Bulgakov is engaging here is this popular scientific line of thinking about nature versus nurture in a really scientific way. And so the science of rejuvenation, which is also a real thing at the time, although that science at this stage is basically about hormones, and we see that reflected too in the book, right? The idea that there is, we're going to use the pituitary gland and the hormones of a monkey and et cetera, right? This was reflective of a real scientific line of inquiry at the time as well, which we now know to be, you know, not... You can't put a monkey's ovaries in people. But to say that he's engaging with scientific ideas that were sort of lighting up both scientists and popular imagination at the time, and have at the heart the idea, and the reason they're so interesting is to go back to this historical context, they have at their heart this idea of what does it mean to be human, and how do we transform the human if we want to do that, and we might want to do that. So that's part of the book that we can think about. There's also the concept of Promethean linguistics. This is a term from Katerina Clark, famous Western Slavist. There's a real effort, and we already saw this a little bit in thinking about that first encounter between Professor Preobrazhensky and the Housing Committee. There's a real emphasis on language. And the idea that language as a conveyance of meaning and as a structural element of human social nature is so essential that changing language can change people, can change society. And so one element of this kind of Promethean linguistics was not exclusively a Russian phenomenon, though many Bolsheviks pick it up, was the idea of like, we're going to get everyone in the world to speak Esperanto and so forth. Like that's a movement that's coming about at this time in the early 20th century. Things of that nature. In the Bolshevik context, it has to do with changing markers of gender, changing markers of class, bureaucratizing, sloganizing, introducing political ideological words, political terminology in general into the language, giving people a language that comes out of political theory for them to use to speak about their daily lives and to encourage that kind of speaking so as to encourage that line of thinking. And we can see this play out in the book. And so one of the things I'd invite you to think about as you read is to look for these instances where we're getting like no bad words allowed. And Bulgakov does something interesting. One, we see this with Schwander, right, in the Housing Committee. And once he gets a hold of the transformed Sherek, once he gets a hold of Sherikov, there's... he tries to introduce, he gives him books and he tries to get him to participate in this particular kind of linguistic conditioning that the Bolsheviks are trying to do around languages to describe processes and hierarchies and ideologies and political theories and the government, right? And so one of the things you can think about is how well that works. And then Preobrazhensky is actually taking on a similar project, although from a sort of different ideological direction, because he is trying to shape Sherikov to speak properly, right? To speak like a good intellectual, to, not use vulgar language and to use the proper forms of address and to be respectful and all this. And it is true at the time of the Bolsheviks that, there's this explicitly sort of political transformational thinking about language that's going on. But there's also many people, Trotsky among them, who want to improve Russian language in general to make it more formal, to make it more intellectual, to increase people's sort of working vocabularies, to make people more literate in general, to standardize things that we would think about as like dialect and accent and things like that, to to eliminate vulgarities, to really encourage people not to swear and not to speak in slang, and to, you know, speak at all times like you're speaking to the teacher, sort of. Well, maybe not me, but, you know, one of those kind of teachers. I don't know. So there's this real moral component in a way that gets introduced to language, which in its elitism is actually strangely counter to the Bolshevik idea, and yet they float around at the same time. And Bulgakov is engaging both of those things. And again, I think it's interesting to look, because there's episodes in the novel that, you know, we go through, like, you know, Schwander is trying to encourage Sherikov to speak in such and such a way, and Preobrazhensky is trying to encourage Sherikov to speak in such and such a way. Like, it's very explicit, right? No bad words allowed. And to think about what their goals are, how they're trying to modify his speech, what their goals are, and how successful it is absolutely one way to approach parsing this novel. And so I would encourage you to try to do that as you read. And again, this is something that the basis of it, at the basis, is sort of like, well, what makes, what structures, what's fundamental to human nature? And again, if we want to change human nature, how can we do this? Which takes me to one of my favorite topics in the book, which is food. And which I said could take us all the way back to thinking from the beginning of the term about food and eating and meat in H.G. Wells, to just think back to that conversation. You know, we talked about the fact that there's this real tension between the sort of bestiality, the supposed devolution of the Morlocks, because they're eating the Eloi, and we see this represented in these, like, you know, hunk of meat that the time traveler finds them gnawing on down in their cave, right? But, you know, whereas the Eloi, these kinds of very refined little beautiful creatures, are just eating fruit and whatever kind of falls off the trees for them. And this goes to thinking that was arising at the time, in which Tolstoy picks up on, we're going to get to that in a second, about vegetarianism being kind of more intellectually and morally elevated as a way to eat than, let us say, carnally, meat eating. And yet the time traveler, the first thing he does when he gets back from the future is we have to hold off on the whole thing. You know, everybody is gathered around in his home, like, oh my God, what's going on with you? And everybody's gathered around in his home. He's like, wait, I gotta eat some mutton. And is just shoving meat into his mouth. And so one of the things to think about is the way in which that draws a line of connection between him and the Morlocks. You know, we kind of thought through that a bit. And also what it means about sort of human nature and human morality. Like, are we carnivores? And what does that mean? And is there a moral dimension to that? And what is it? And is it beastliness? And so then what is the line between human and animal? And does that line even exist when we think about Darwin and his theories, you know, as we did with the time traveler? And if you've ever read The Island of Dr. Moreau by Wells, he picks up on these themes again, and it's something that's concerning to him. And I think it's something that Bulgakov picks up, which, you know, we pointed out in the first chapter. There's this, you know, you might take it as just like, oh, a throwaway line, but it's not. This whole thing where Sherik is like, the cook for the Count's Tolstoy fed us dogs well, right? And he talks about throwing out these big meaty bones so that, you know, you could get a decent meal if you were a stray dog from the kitchen of the Count's Tolstoy. But the irony, of course, is that Tolstoy was a vegetarian, and it's hilarious if you read his wife's like journals and her entries and letters and her biography, her memoirs. She's so sick of Tolstoy shit regarding food. So I want to say, first of all, that I was a vegetarian for about 10 years, so I'm sympathetic to the cause. And we take it for granted now that it's pretty easy to be a vegetarian. Well, I mean, in some societies it's been natural forever to be vegetarian. In our society in America, we take it as for granted. It's pretty easy to be a vegetarian. It takes a little more work to be vegan, right? I mean, limited options, but it's doable. And this is the case now in Russia too. It's not that hard to be a vegetarian, and this has to do with globalized food systems, which are problematic for other reasons, but nevertheless open up these kinds of options and choices for people. Traditionally, and when I say that Tolstoy is a vegetarian, he's using the parlance of the times, but it meant what we now call vegan. Traditionally in Russian society, this kind of veganism was difficult. I mean, it was expensive and complex. And so you have Sophia Tolstoy talking about at length how he's so obnoxious. He goes to people's homes. He demands things like almond milk that absolutely no one in Russia would have had, and it wouldn't have been easy to procure. And he's also picky about bread and what grains he's going to eat and this and that and around her. She also says he's a glutton. He's obsessed with food. She accuses him of talking about food and eating too much and eating inadvisedly. She's like, well, he just got over dysentery and just eating too damn much. So food for Tolstoy is a thing, and he was obnoxious about it, apparently, and that is not surprising at all to me from reading about Tolstoy. And so first of all, let's think about this for a second. One, let us get out the fact that Bulgakov was actually an enormous fan of Tolstoy's work. And two, let us set the record straight that Bulgakov writes about food in many of his books at great length, and he himself was a bit of a gourmand in real life, although his characters that he likes rarely eat at all in many of his books. But nevertheless, he obviously loved to describe a feast, and we see this on display in Heart of a Dog, right? I mean, this sort of constant description of food and eating and cooking and etc. So on one hand, you could see him as, in a sense, picking a little bit of a fight with Tolstoy, but he's taking it seriously. He thinks in one of his letters, he's thought that he said every sentence Tolstoy ever wrote was a miracle. He didn't mean it ironically. So he's a fan of Tolstoy. So I mean, this is not for nothing. So one thing that's interesting about Tolstoy's veganism at the time is that, and again, there's a global movement of this vegetarianism that we can I mentioned beginning in the late 19th century in England and other places, but is carrying through around the world, so this is by the very early 20th century. Tolstoy is writing about things like this. The book is in 1925. He's already been talking about this for the last 20 years or so, Tolstoy. Most vegetarians at the time see as the goal itself to be less destructive to nature, kinder to animals, right? To end animal suffering, to end the destruction that animal agriculture can do to natural systems. This is the end unto itself. Eventually, these kind of global vegetarian movements kind of break with Tolstoy because he is not so much worried about animal welfare per se, or the welfare of nature per se. Rather, he sees vegetarianism as sort of as a habitual act that can lead us to superior human morality. Fake it till you make it, basically. He says explicitly in his writings that once we begin to tolerate cruelty at all, including towards animals, we are on a slope where we will descend to tolerating any kind of cruelty to mankind as well. He sees these as being fundamentally connected, and that if we wish to become morally better, it's not that being vegetarian is itself morally good. It's that foregoing that cruelty will train us into habits of empathy and compassion, and will eventually, among other things, among other actions, lead us to being good people morally. So it's not exactly the same thing, right? And it's a statement about something to maybe think through. It's a statement about how human behavior affects human consciousness. Again, what is it? What is at the heart of humanness? Right? Something there's a gulf between belief and action, this supposes. But that action can change around belief. Right? Tolstoy sort of indirectly asserts here. He also had a tendency to talk about writing like his in moral terms. And so in places he says that, critics don't like his work, critics don't understand his work because they want to be entertained, and maybe some readers don't like his work because they just want to be entertained. And he compares this to eating meat, to carnal, animalistic eating habits. That kind of writing is intellectual food for dogs. So you see that we're mixing two metaphors here. And the kind of writing he does is spiritual food. It's intellectual food for another better kind of reader. It's food for the spirit, so to speak. So, we're mixing this metaphor here of the idea of reading with eating. And by doing that, we're talking about writing with like high moral and philosophical intent as being vegetarian, and writing that's just for, entertainment's sake, as being meat eating, right? Being meatitarian. And that, I don't know if you can hear it, but one cat is hissing at another over here, getting salty. Speaking of bestiality. But that meat food is for dogs. He literally says this in one piece. That's food for dogs. And he's set a table intellectually for a different kind of reader, presumably a human kind, right? And when we say human here, obviously we mean some fully ascended moral human. So that alone takes a little bit of parsing out. But this is kind of the world of ideas and value judgments, and the use of food as metaphor, and different kinds of food, right, within this metaphorical structure, that Bulgakov is engaging with. And so when we turn to the book itself, we open up with Sherek, the dog, talking about how the food in the proletarian, in the Bolshevik cafeteria, isn't fit for humans. And so in that sense, the Bolsheviks have failed, right? There's a kind of failure there. And so now, instead of thinking about vegetarian food versus meat eating, we're thinking about food that is suitable for humans versus food that is suitable for dogs, and therefore just animals in general, right? So this division between human and animal, what's the line? And that sausage that the professor picks up and lures Sherek to his apartment with, Sherek is like, oh, if you knew what was in that, you'd never eat it, better give it to me, right? This idea between human food and dog food. But then the professor gets back to his apartment, and his housekeeper is like, oh, give him that sausage, I'll take that sausage, right? And of course then the professor is like, this isn't fit for a human, right? So very early on in the novel, we're drawing this sort of like food for humans, food for animals. And right away we've kind of asserted that the Bolsheviks are incapable of feeding humans what they need, which, is a criticism in and of itself. But then things get more opaque than that. So one thing we see is the professor feeding Sherek human food all the time, right? We have this elaborate banquet, this elaborate feast. I invite you to spend some special time reading through that and thinking through that. This elaborate food, and the professor, who is so protective of his dining room, we eat in the dining room. Dine in the dining room, right? And this elaborate food, which, again, consider the little typist from the first chapter. This has now become a class situation, right? It's not about the moral difference, say, between vegetarians and meat eaters. It's about human life, right? Being dependent on class. People, certain people can get enough good food to eat, regardless of what it is, and certain people can't. And the people that can get enough good food to eat are in the position of the professor, which we've already discussed is this very, like, you know, considering what the stated ideals of the Bolsheviks are, it's extremely hypocritical, right? We've got these NEP men, we've got these holdover bourgeoisie, we have these new party men who are like drunk on their own power, you know, the guy that's dating the little typist, I'll eat lobster now, there's no life after death. So now there's this question of who can get enough decent food to eat and who can't. And so now there's something maybe morally suspect about the professor's, you know, lavish spread of you know, gourmet delicacies, when we know that average people outside in Moscow are not getting good food to eat and enough of it, right? They're eating that rotten corned beef soup. So now we've, you know, Bulgakov has taken food into a kind of different moral duality to think through. And we also see that this question of, like, you know, if an animal eats human food, will it become a human? Sherrick is eating human food from the moment he sets foot in Preobrazhensky's apartment and enjoying it. And yet he cannot become a human. And so if we trace this metaphor back to Tolstoy, this idea of, you know, oh, the behavior of what we consume in terms of intellectual food, or even in terms of actual food, will affect our moral habits to the point where it can change us, to change our nature. Bulgakov in a way is rejecting, right? Because Sherrick eats plenty of human food, but he cannot make the transition to humanness. And in fact, once he becomes a human, he stops appreciating human food and is acting like a dog. He, you know, he eats toothpaste and he won't do anything but consume vodka and etc. Right? And so this is a faulty line. Food for humans, food for animals. And I haven't fully parsed this here, but my point is to kind of give you a jumping off point to think about it, and then we can talk about it. And I said again, like with the language and like with the eugenics and this question of nature and nurture and the new Soviet man, all of this really brings us back to this question of what makes human nature. What makes a human human? You know, there's one point in the book where the professor and Bormenthal are coming around to the realization that one of the reasons the transformation of Sherrick into Sherikov didn't work is because the human parts they gave them came from a bad human, right? Klim Chigunkin is this dreadful person, and his parts turned the dog into a dreadful, not quite person. You know, and the professor says something like, I probably won't be able to find it here, you know, Bormenthal says something like, a human with a heart of a dog. And, you know, the doctor says, no, it's much worse than that. He has the heart of a man, and the vilest kind of one. Right? And so, yeah. Here it is. It's on page 105. The whole horror, you see, is that his heart is no longer a dog's heart, but a human one, and the vilest one you could find. And what do we mean when we say a dog's heart? Because here the dog's heart is preferable to a bad human heart. And so one thing, obviously, we could see from Tolstoy's metaphor and just from our own linguistic, you know, kind of tendency, I wouldn't feed my dog that. You wouldn't treat him like you're treating him worse than a dog, right? I mean, we're familiar with that kind of thing. But on the other hand, we associate dogs with these, like, positive things, right? Oh, you know, man's best friend, and so forth. And so the dog itself, in human thought, in human language, in human metaphoric representation, occupies a kind of liminal space. It's an animal, but it's our but it's our good friend animal. And so the dog itself already like just as a concept, dog, comes freighted with some mixed meaning that Bulgakov is playing with, right? And that we have to think about. And so here is this, like I said, very, very weighted animal symbol. And one thing that I'm going to bring up now, and I hope to talk about a little bit more next week in the context of Bloodchild too, is Luce Irigaray, who is a feminist, post-structural linguist. She said that women in writing tend to become spaces. It's woman marks an absence that we flood in with meaning beyond just woman. You can meditate upon that. But then other critics have pointed out that we do the same thing with animals in literature, at least in the West. That when we read something, in films as well, when we read something with an animal prominently featured in it, that animal is not just an animal. It marks a blank space in which we project meaning, many kinds of meanings, right? And that kind of work that an animal does in a text in terms of signification, remember, signification, is complex and not necessarily straightforward, and on its own deserves thinking about. So here we have an animal in the text that is sort of bearing up an entire question, not what it means to be a dog, but what it means to be a human. And something about this question of humanness seems to have to do with consumption. Consumption of ideas, consumption of food itself. And much of this seems to be about drawing the line between the human and the animal. But one thing I'd like us to think about is how truly bad badly drawn, let us say, that line actually is here. And I said, kind of keeping this in mind to go forward into next week too, that Sherikov, the person, the human, is not quite a human. Doesn't make it. Sherrick, the dog, is more human in his inner life, in his appreciation of food, than Sherikov, who has a job and has papers and talks and reads and joined the party and picked a name for himself, polygraph, none of that makes a human a human. What makes a human a human? Does something draw a line between humans and animals? Right? What would it be then? This is the idea we're hovering around. So, and this, this book takes a couple, it entertains the idea that language is fundamentally important to humans. Food, both in a literal sense and in an intellectual sense. This idea of consumption, which I said takes us back to Wells. The sort of savagery that goes into literally consuming other living things. But is it savagery? Animals eat each other. It's what we do. The idea of social construct versus biology, right? We already discussed the fact that little Sherrick the dog is a very biologizing dog. He's like, no, he's a gentleman, you can tell. Right? It's in his eyes. Something immutable, something heritable. By the end of the book, he's like, I think there was a Newfoundland in my background. My grandmother was a whore, God rest her. Right? This kind of, this very biologist, very nature. argument versus this very nurture thing that the Bolsheviks are trying to achieve. And then this question of, well, if it is nature, can science alter it? And Preobrazhensky, as a sort of science creator, mad scientist, right, of the book, is like, yeah, I guess we can, but why bother? Any peasant woman can have a Lomonosov. Right. So I'd like you to use these ideas as a jumping off point to sort of mull upon it, right? And then we'll talk about it on Zoom.